Welcome to Night Talks, the University of Florida College of Journalism Communications talk show, produced by students for students. I'm Valentina Sandoval, a sophomore studying journalism, and our guest today is Sara Ganim, who is an award-winning crime reporter for several organizations and as a correspondent for CNN. And now she's a freelance journalist, as well as a journalist in residence for the UF's College of Journalism Communications Brechner Center for Freedom of Information. Hi, Sara. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, you're a graduate of Penn State University's communication program. Did you always see yourself as a reporter?
You know, from the earliest days I can remember, I loved to write, and my parents would tell you that I loved to ask questions from the moment that I could talk. It took me a while to put those two things together, but somewhere around age 15, my mom clipped a newspaper clipping. So I grew up in South Florida. The Sun Sentinel was our hometown newspaper. And back then there was still a section of the newspaper that was produced completely by teenage reporters, high school reporters for high schoolers. And she clipped that section out for me and she put it on my desk in my room and she was like, I think you should do this. And I went and I wrote my first story. And I just absolutely fell in love, not just with the process of writing and reporting, but the atmosphere of being in a newsroom. And from that moment, I knew that I wanted to be a reporter and nothing else. And I pretty much tailored my college experience in order to sort of try to match that atmosphere, that feeling of being in a newsroom. I picked Penn State because I visited the college newspaper, and you walked into their newsroom and you got that same feeling. The papers piled so high that it was a fire hazard, and people sitting around chatting about stories, and pizza boxes that were 2 weeks old in the corner. And I knew that that's where I wanted to be and where I wanted to learn how to be a journalist.
That's an amazing starting story. So after college, you worked for the Center Daily Times, followed by the Patriot News, both based in Pennsylvania. As a crime reporter for these outlets, what did your role entail and what were some of your biggest challenges?
Yeah, so, being a local reporter is so great because you get to, especially at smaller outlets, at the start of your career, what was so beneficial to me was the ability to try new things. And, when you're at a newspaper with 5 reporters and, maybe 2 or 3 editors, you have the ability to grab a camera and run out and try a photo story or, to maybe write something in a non-traditional way and see how it works. I had the benefit of starting in newsrooms where I had the ability to be creative, to write and report on lots of different kinds of stories, and to really, and to some degree, make small mistakes in a place where the stakes were not huge, and really grow and learn in those places. You're also covering news that's really impactful and important to the people who are consuming that news, which is not always true when you kind of graduate to big national news organizations. You don't always feel that immediate impact that you would feel when you cover a house fire and your story leads to donations to the people who lost their home, or when you cover, a local trial and you can see the borough council or the state legislature pass laws that come from that. That kind of sense of community and that kind of local journalism really, not only did it teach me a lot, but it became really the bedrock and the foundation of my philosophy about reporting after I moved on from those places.
That's amazing. I love that you started from the base of it. I feel like it's very important to tell stories of local things rather than just big national events. Obviously, those are just as important, but it's always important to like stay at home first and then grow from that. So I think that's awesome that you did that. So you broke the story that Jerry Sandusky was under investigation for sexual abuse allegations. Can you share a little bit with us about how you approached such a difficult story, not only thematically, but also because it was your shining a light on your alma mater?
Yeah, it really goes back to your first question, which is I approached it as a local story about local people. I didn't, for better or for worse, I did not see it becoming a big national news story that would be so impactful or so career-changing for me personally. I was a crime reporter and someone told me about a crime and I wanted to go investigate that and see if that was true, if those allegations were true. You know, it wasn't the first story that I ever covered that was not going to put my alma mater into
Perfect light.
That was not going to shed a good light on my alma mater. Right, thank you. In fact, there were plenty of stories before that I had written that did not look favorably upon Penn State, and I was very used to the sort of fan backlash that would come with writing stories like that. I was no longer at that point under the delusion that like Penn State could do nothing wrong. But there are things that certainly you have to think about as a reporter when you're covering stories about crime and covering stories about such intimate trauma. And it can be different than a lot of other beats in that you're talking to people oftentimes about the worst days of their lives. And for you, it's just another day because it's part of your job. For them, it is a really hard day, a very difficult day. Yeah, and so, I certainly learned a lot in both ways, about how local reporting can have a big impact nationally, but also how those kinds of stories deserve an extra level of care.
After the Patriot News, you became a correspondent with CNN. How was the change in that? How did your roles kind of switch around, with, as you said, becoming from something smaller to such a big news station?
It was a huge transition for me because not only was I going from being a local reporter in a small town where I could literally, walk or drive a couple of miles to pretty much any source that I had or any event that I was covering. Or, if I wanted to dig a little bit, I could just go on a Saturday and dig a little bit. But I was also switching mediums, too. So switching from a local print reporter to a national cable news correspondent is, a lot of change in one moment. And so, too much change, to be honest. So the transition was significant. And, I'm glad I had the experience because where it has landed me today, a decade later, is in a really good position where I can be comfortable in many different mediums, be comfortable telling stories in small towns and big towns and on a large scale and on a very, micro scale too. And I feel that it's put me in a place where I can really think about every individual story that I want to tell. What's the best platform for that story? What's the best vehicle for delivering it? How can I be the best steward of that story, taking a story from the person or the people where it originates to the world? And that's a really special place to be in because I don't feel like, well, I really truly only know how to write a story, so if I want to tell it, I have to write it. I get to decide what medium is best to tell a story in the most impactful way, and that's what that transition did for me.
I feel like that's also very good advice for students right now. One of the things that everybody says is try everything until you find exactly what you like. You definitely did that. So with CNN, actually, in 2018, you produced a documentary called Dirty Water, Danger from the Tap. Tell us a little about how that project came together and the work that it took behind the scenes.
Yeah, that project actually started years before because I was a breaking news weekend reporter for a while when I was at CNN, and the Flint water crisis really erupted on a weekend. It was an ongoing issue for the people there, for the local reporters who were covering it. But national news didn't quite pick up on it until this one sort of random weekend in 2014. It might not have been 2014, to be honest, actually, this one random weekend. And I got deployed to Flint in sort of the way that CNN and other news organizations often do, where they just pluck somebody who's available and say, go, and, find a story or tell the story. I got sent to Flint on a weekend, and I ended up spending a significant amount of time reporting on the ground there, and really contaminated water became a beat of mine for a while. And that's what led to the documentary. Years later, coming out of Flint, like, what did water contamination look like? What did it feel like? How was it being dealt with in rural America? And that's where Danger from the Tap came from.
So after that, you became the journalist in residence for the CJC's Bregner Center. What is this center, its mission, and the importance of freedom of information?
My role at the Bregner Center is running a podcast called Why Don't We Know, which looks at government secrecy and data deserts. Data deserts are basically things that you being the average person might think the government would be tracking and keeping tabs on, disseminating information about to the public, but they're not. And so the podcast really is about taking topics that you may have heard of, like concussions in athletics or the criminal justice system, about body camera footage, about accessibility to records, about bullying, or about gun violence in schools, taking these big themes, these big headlines that everyone has heard of before, and digging deeper into the data that exists or does not exist, and the secrecy that persists, and that and how that secrecy and that lack of information makes it so that these are problems that are harder to solve. And really, part of this idea came from my years at CNN, where it was not uncommon for me to be constantly covering the same kind of stories, the same kind of bad things, the same kind of trauma, to be interviewing people year after year about basically the same set of facts, And year after year, you would hear families and victims and advocates say, never again, we're going to fix this problem. And then the next year or the next month, you'd be covering the same story. And it began as an introspective look at why. Why is that? Why are we always covering the same stories? Why can't we fix some of these big top-line problems? And is secrecy and the lack of data contributing to that?
It is very interesting, especially since I feel like a lot of this lack of information affects communities locally too a lot. So that kind of goes back to your thing about how important it is to tell local news, because it does, that lack of information, that lack of knowing what's going on in these big systems is precisely what makes other places like Flint be in the situations that they're in. Regarding this precisely, similar things, in 2020, you created another documentary titled No Defense. Did it take a huge amount of investigative work to uncover the story of the U.S. military being one of the largest polluters in the country?
Yeah, and this particular story actually wasn't what I would consider to be investigative. It was more about aggregating a lot of little stories that were popping up around the country about this topic of military pollution here domestically, and pulling them together to see a big picture, which was that the military was the number one polluter of this one particular group of chemicals called forever chemicals, which are basically everywhere and very, very difficult to get rid of, and contaminate a lot of people's drinking water, especially around military bases. So communities that house military bases and the people who live on them or near them. And, you know, the story is really about the people. It's about the veterans and their families and the communities around these bases that haven't been able to get help for many years because the government has been refusing to clean up this mess. And then bigger than that, because the government is both the polluter and the regulator, it leads to a lot of other pollution by private companies, because the government's reluctant to regulate private companies for doing something that they're also doing. And so it really truly affects all of us. And so that documentary wasn't about digging. It was actually right there. It was just about showing people the big picture and kind of connecting a lot of dots.
It was about adding it all together.
Yeah, it was about adding it all up.
That's very interesting. So going back to the Why Don't We Know podcast, what role did the Freedom of Information Acts play in trying to find this information in data deserts?
Yeah, when we started the Why Don't We Know project, the idea was like, let's go after all the data that doesn't exist, and then we'll put it out there. Well, that is actually a really difficult thing to do. But not only that, the part of the reason that it doesn't exist in a database somewhere already is because it's very difficult when the government doesn't mandate data to be collected to go after it at the micro level and try to aggregate that in a way that is contextually authentic, you know, that's not comparing apples to oranges. And so what we did instead, we used public records requests to see where the data gaps are. So essentially, if we get a request back and it shows really great data, that often does not become a story. What we're looking for are the denials or the requests that come back with the answer, we don't keep that information. When people say to me, or when I get a request back that says that data doesn't exist, that is a huge red flag for me, because I'm like, why not? How, for example, episode 1 of season 1, how could schools not be keeping track of concussions of athletes? That makes no sense, right? So that's a story. It became more about where the secrecy is, where the privacy is. And students play a huge role in that, because public records requests they can be really burdensome. They take a lot of time. Students do a lot of really good help helping us organize those requests to get them out there and to get them back. Students are also playing a huge role in reporting reporting for the podcast. You know, they come on air and they discuss with me what they've found behind the scenes. They're also doing things like fact checking and background research for future episodes. We have students our entire edit staff is students, so students are editing the podcast, working on sound design and equalizing the podcast, making it sound professional at the end of the day. So it could not be done without UF students at the CJC, and they truly are the backbone of the podcast.
That's amazing. It's awesome that you're giving them that opportunity to have so much experience in the field and also in investigating, because that's like 90% of reporting is that. So it's definitely a good experience. You do have another podcast that you produce called The Mayor of Maple Avenue. So what led to continuing the story of Sean Sinisi, a victim of Jerry Sandusky?
Yeah, this was a story I never thought that I was going to tell. It wasn't one that I was looking for. In fact, I had pretty much closed the book on covering the Sandusky story. And then one day I got a call from a mother of one of his victims, a victim who I had not heard of before. He was not part of the criminal case. And she basically just started telling me in this phone call about the troubles that her son had had since Sandusky's arrest. And for me, it was a moment of introspection where I realized, like, all of the rest of us, and I I'm speaking on behalf of society here for a moment, we all kind of like threw our arms up in victory when Sandusky was convicted, or when any bad guy in these situations is convicted or loses their job. You know, in a post-Me Too world, there's this sense that like, if this person's called out and there's a consequence, then hooray, like we've won. The story is over. And certainly for the media, it is over. They move on. And so this was a story about how it's not over for the victims of those crimes, of those bad acts. And, you know, Sean's story is particularly depressing because he spent about a decade really wrestling with what happened to him, dealing with, drug addiction, and just all of the societal safety nets failed this man. He became addicted to drugs, and when he got the label of addict, people started to look at him differently and treat him differently. And then, as often happens, the addiction led to criminal activity, and then he was, labeled a criminal, and then he was certainly perceived differently. So he goes from being a victim to an addict to a criminal, and suddenly, the societal structures aren't working. People don't seem to treat him the way that they would treat him if they saw him as an 8-year-old who had been abused by someone. He was just like this criminal, And so the mayor of Maple Avenue is Sean's story of life and eventually of death by overdose in a McDonald's bathroom.
Oh my God. I feel like that is definitely a very important perspective to tell. It's very easy to get caught up on the news and on the big picture of everything, that you don't think about the way that those news affect people individually. So it is exceptionally great that you made a story about him specifically. I really love that. So turning back to your involvement with universities, you, apart from your involvement with UF, you also began working as the James Madison visiting professor on First Amendment issues at Columbia University in New York. What are some of the big ideas that we should all care about in regard to the First Amendment?
Yeah, I think, the First Amendment is so vital to the conversation right now about the health of democracy, the ability for journalists to do their work uninterrupted, unhindered. It's such an important pillar of the democracy, of our democracy. I think back to my early days as a reporter at the tiny little Center Daily Times, when I was probably 19 or 20 years old, and I was in the court clerk's office one day, and the precedent judge came in, and he was like, "Oh, the CDT is here, the Fourth Estate," and I was like, "What the heck is that?" And so he probably could tell by my naive face that I was like, and he goes, there's the executive branch, and there's the judicial branch, and there's Congress, and then unofficially there's the media. And it always stuck with me, that moment where I kind of realized, oh my gosh, this is a really important job. And I want to make sure that the next generation of journalists is neither discouraged by the economic state of the industry or by the cultural and political attacks on the industry. So that's always been important to me, but I think it's more important than ever right now.
That is also very important to me personally. I have faced many people saying that, the media is just full of bias and full of everything. And yes, obviously there is bias in the media, but we have a job to tell the truth, and that's something that nobody else is going to do the way we do it. So there is very much a need for more reporting. There's very much a need for us to tell stories. So
it's certainly not a perfect industry, and everybody in it isn't doing a perfect job. But I mean, first of all, find me an industry where there's no flaws. But I really don't want, what I don't want is that to discourage the next generation of journalists or to attract the wrong kind of journalists in our next generation. And so I think it's very important.
So speaking of the media too, you've worked in media across print, cable, and podcasting. Do you see journalism heading in a new interesting direction, with social media and everything else coming up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think that social media and the role it plays in journalism has been a part of the conversation for many years now. And people are still trying to figure it out, I think, and I think there's a lot of cool stuff out there. And I think that people are consuming their news in a lot of different and cool ways. TikTok, who would have ever thought that TikTok would be a place where people got so much of their news, but it is effective. It's very effective. I don't so much focus on platforms anymore. What I focus on is what's the right story for the right platform. So there are really effective ways of using social to tell stories, but not every story belongs there. But the vice versa is true as well. And so my focus right now, my own professional life, but also when I talk to people in settings like this, is really trying to emphasize this idea that you think about the right place for the story.
That's very interesting. So in this switch that you've done through media and everything, what advice would you share with aspiring journalists?
My biggest piece of advice, I think, is to think of yourself as a journalist first, not as a print journalist, not as a broadcast journalist, not as someone who wants to be a podcaster, someone who wants to write magazine stories. Think of yourself as a journalist first, and then and really educate yourself in as many platforms, gather information about as many techniques as possible. It's not just because it could help you tell stories better, but it actually can help you more easily get a job. It really gives you flexibility in shaky economic times to go after jobs that you care about, where you're covering the kinds of stories that you want and not have to worry like, oh, I can't cover environmental justice for NPR because I've never done radio before. Or, oh, I really can't, I can't cover race and economics for, a magazine because I've never written a 10,000 word story. Like having flexibility in your skill set and a diverse skill set is really, really important and will help, I think, a lot of journalists be more successful.
All right, thank you so much. You provided a lot of important insight, both for future journalists and just for the people in general. As you said, it's very important to keep the public informed and to always focus both in local and national news. I enjoyed this talk a lot. I hope you did too.
I did.
Thank you again for your insight, and thank you, our viewers, for joining us. Until next time, and good night.